The night was electric with the hum of the city, the kind of night where success and scandal walked hand in hand. The penthouse suite of a luxury hotel overlooked the skyline, glittering with the promise of power. Inside, Julian Carter adjusted the cuffs of his tailored suit, his reflection staring back at him in the gold-framed mirror. He was everything a man of his status should be: wealthy, charming, and ruthless when necessary. Yet as he reached for his Rolex, his hand hesitated. For just a second, he knew what he was about to do, and yet he had convinced himself it was the right move. Downstairs, his wife Vanessa sat on their king-size bed, scrolling through old photos on her phone. She was beautiful, effortlessly so, with deep brown skin that glowed under the soft bedroom lights. But tonight, that beauty wasn't enough. Not for Julian. He had made up his mind. He had told her earlier that he was heading to an important business meeting, one that could secure a billion-dollar deal. What he hadn't told her was that she wouldn't be by his side. Instead, across town, a woman slipped into a sleek red dress, her lips curving into a knowing smile. Melanie. She was everything society told men, like Julian, they should want. Fair-skinned, statuesque, and the kind of woman who turned heads in the right circles. She knew her place in Julian's world, and tonight, she would be the woman on his arm. Julian's company had been struggling behind closed doors. The investors were losing confidence, and the board was restless. This meeting was his chance to secure a partnership that would silence his critics. But there was one problem: perception. The men in power, the ones who controlled everything. They had a certain image in mind when they thought of the wife of a CEO. And Julian knew, deep down, that Vanessa didn't fit that image. So he made a choice. As his driver pulled up to Melanie's apartment, Julian barely hesitated before stepping out. He knocked once, and the door swung open. She stood there, her perfume sweet and intoxicating, her hand resting on the door frame. "Right on time," she purred, reaching for his tie playfully. Julian smirked, but it was strained. "Let's go." Meanwhile, Vanessa sat in their penthouse, staring at the clock. Something felt off. Julian had been distant lately, dismissive even. The way he spoke to her had changed. The way he barely looked at her when they were out together. She shook the thoughts away, convincing herself that it was just business stress. But then she saw it. A text flashed on his tablet, the one he had carelessly left on the nightstand. She wasn't one to invade his privacy, but something about the message made her stomach tighten. "I'll be waiting downstairs. Hope you like the dress. Tonight is going to be unforgettable." Her heart pounded as she read the words again, her breath hitching. She didn't need to think too hard to know who that was. At the Grand Hotel ballroom, Julian walked in with Melanie draped on his arm, her hand delicately placed on his chest. Heads turned, murmurs spread. She looked the part, and Julian felt a twisted sense of relief. The investors greeted him warmly, their eyes flicking to Melanie with approval. "Julian, my boy," one of them said, clapping him on the back. "Finally found yourself a proper lady to match your success, huh?" Julian chuckled, but his grip on his champagne glass tightened. Across the city, Vanessa sat frozen. Her mind raced, piecing together all the small, subtle signs she had ignored. The late nights, the sudden work trips, the way Julian always seemed slightly embarrassed to be seen with her at events. She inhaled sharply, standing up. No, she wasn't going to sit here and wonder. She needed answers. Grabbing her coat, she stepped out of the penthouse, her heart hammering. At the event, Julian was basking in the approval of the room, but just as he was about to seal the deal with a handshake, his blood ran cold. The room seemed to shift, and suddenly, the whispers weren't about his business prowess or his beautiful companion. They were about something else, because standing in the entrance, eyes locked on him, was Vanessa, and she wasn't here to stay silent. Julian's breath caught in his throat as Vanessa stepped forward. The soft murmur of conversation around them faded into a dull hum. Every investor, every business partner, every socialite in the room turned to look at the woman standing at the entrance, the wife Julian had chosen to leave behind tonight. Vanessa stood tall, her deep brown skin glowing under the golden chandeliers. She wore a sleek black dress, elegant yet understated, a stark contrast to Melanie's attention-grabbing red. Her expression wasn't one of anger or humiliation. It was something worse. It was knowing. It was understanding. It was the look of a woman who had just confirmed her worst fears. Julian swallowed hard, but his body remained frozen. Melanie, standing beside him, let out a breathy laugh. "Well," she whispered, leaning in slightly. "This is awkward." The room waited. Vanessa took another step, and the sound of her heels against the marble floor seemed louder than the music. Julian felt the pressure of every set of eyes on him. He could already hear the whispers forming. Was that his wife? Who was the other woman? What kind of man brings his mistress to an event like this? Julian had been so sure of his decision just hours ago. He had convinced himself that this was the only way to secure his future, that bringing Vanessa would have been a risk, that she wouldn't fit in, that the people in this room wouldn't respect him if they saw her by his side. But now, looking at her, he wasn't so sure. Vanessa reached the center of the room, and Julian saw something flicker across her face. Hurt, disappointment, but also something steadier, something unshakable. "Julian," she said, her voice smooth, but firm. "I didn't realize this meeting was so exclusive." Her words were careful, calculated, not an outburst, not a confrontation, just enough to make everyone listen. Melanie shifted uncomfortably, but Julian stayed silent, his jaw tight. The investors looked at him expectantly. This was his moment to speak, to explain, to control the situation. But what was there to say? Vanessa glanced at Melanie, her gaze lingering just long enough to make the other woman fidget. Then she looked back at Julian. "I assume she's here to help with negotiations." A few quiet chuckles rippled through the crowd, but Julian didn't laugh. He knew what Vanessa was doing. She wasn't causing a scene. She wasn't making a spectacle of herself. She was doing something worse. She was making him look like a fool without even raising her voice. One of the investors, a seasoned businessman named Richard Gaines, cleared his throat. "Julian, I thought we'd be meeting your wife tonight." Julian forced a tight smile, but his hands were clammy. "Vanessa, this isn't..." But before he could finish, Vanessa turned to Richard, ignoring Julian altogether. "I appreciate the invitation," she said warmly. "I wasn't aware this was a +1 kind of meeting." Richard's brow furrowed as he glanced between Julian and Melanie. "Neither was I." That was all it took. The mood in the room shifted, and Julian knew the damage had been done. Melanie must have felt it too, because she suddenly pulled back, taking a step away from him. "I should go," she muttered under her breath. But it was too late. She had already been seen. Vanessa held her gaze on Julian for a moment longer, before turning on her heel. "Vanessa, wait," Julian said, his voice quiet but urgent. She stopped, but didn't turn around. There was so much he wanted to say, so much he wanted to fix. But what could he say? That he had been ashamed? That he had thought her presence would hurt his reputation? The truth was, Julian had built his life on appearances, on making the right connections, the right impressions. on crafting the perfect image. And tonight, all of that had crumbled. Because in trying to impress the world, he had destroyed the one thing that had ever truly mattered. Vanessa finally turned her head slightly, just enough for him to see the side of her face. "I'll be home," she said softly, "if you even know where that is anymore." And with that, she walked away. Julian watched her go, his hands clenched into fists. The investors murmured among themselves, some shaking their heads, some exchanging knowing glances. The deal he had been so desperate to secure. It didn't matter anymore, because for the first time in his life, Julian Carter realized he had been chasing the wrong kind of success. And now he might have lost the only person who had ever truly believed in him. Julian stood there, frozen, as Vanessa disappeared through the grand doors of the ballroom. The weight of the moment settled on his shoulders, heavier than he had ever imagined. The murmurs around him grew louder, judgment hanging in the air like a thick fog. The investors, the executives, the people he had been so desperate to impress. All of them saw what had just happened, and worse, they understood exactly what kind of man he had revealed himself to be. Melanie, shifting beside him, let out an awkward breath. "Well, that was unexpected," she mumbled, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. Julian didn't respond. His hands were clenched, his jaw tight, but for the first time, it wasn't out of anger or frustration. It was regret, deep, painful regret that settled in his chest like a stone. "Julian," Richard Gaines said, stepping forward with a look that held no amusement, "I have to say, I'm disappointed, and not just in how you handled this meeting." Julian's throat was dry. "Richard, the older man held up a hand. "Don't bother. If you think a man's worth is based on how well he fits an image, then you don't understand real success." His voice was low but firm. "I came here tonight expecting to meet a man with integrity. Instead, I saw a husband embarrassed by his own wife. And if that's how you handle personal loyalty, why should I believe you'll be loyal in business?" Julian had no answer. The investors around him exchanged glances, nodding subtly. The decision had been made. Richard sighed. "We're not moving forward with this deal." The words hit Julian like a punch to the stomach. This was supposed to be the night he secured everything. Instead, he had lost it all. His business opportunity, his reputation, and worst of all, Vanessa. Melanie took another step back, sensing the shift in the room. "I think I'll go," she muttered, grabbing her clutch. "Good luck, Julian." And just like that, she was gone too. For the first time in a long time, Julian felt completely alone. The drive home felt longer than usual, the city lights blurring past as his driver remained silent. Julian sat in the back seat, loosening his tie, running his hand down his face. He had spent so much of his life crafting an image, believing that his success depended on how others saw him. But tonight proved something he should have always known. Real worth wasn't in perception. It was in the people who stood by you, even when no one else did. And Vanessa had always stood by him. Until now, when he reached the penthouse, he found the door slightly ajar. His heart clenched. He stepped inside cautiously, and there she was, Vanessa, standing in the middle of the living room, a half-packed suitcase. Open on the couch, she didn't look up right away. Her hands moved slowly, neatly folding a blouse before placing it into the bag. Julian had faced some of the most ruthless businessmen in the industry, but he had never felt fear the way he did now. "Vanessa," he started, voice quieter than he intended. She zipped up the suitcase without looking at him. "You don't have to explain," she said, her tone calm but firm. "I already know everything. Julian exhaled sharply, stepping forward. No, you don't. She finally looked up then, and he wished she hadn't, because her eyes weren't filled with anger. They were filled with sadness. Julian, she whispered, shaking her head. You didn't just cheat on me tonight. You made a choice. You decided that I wasn't good enough to stand beside you, and that hurts more than anything else. He swallowed hard. I was wrong, he admitted. I thought... He paused, running a hand through his hair. I thought I had to prove something to them. That being with you would make me look weak. She nodded slowly, processing his words. And what do you think now? His chest felt tight. That. I was a fool. He took another step forward, but she didn't move. Vanessa, I don't care what they think anymore. I don't care about the investors, or the image, or the business. I care about you, and I can't lose you. She studied him for a long moment. What do you want me to say, Julian? That I can just forget this happened? No, he admitted. But I want you to know that I see it now. I see what I did. I see what I risked losing. His voice grew desperate. And I'll spend the rest of my life making it right, if you let me. A silence stretched between them, heavy and uncertain. Then Vanessa sighed, closing her eyes briefly before opening them again. I don't know if I can just forgive you, she admitted. But I do know that love isn't enough. It's about respect. And if you ever want a chance to fix this, that's what you need to earn back. Julian nodded, his throat tightening. I will. She didn't give him an answer that night. She picked up her suitcase and walked toward the door. But just before stepping out, she paused. I'll be at my sister's for a while, she said softly. Maybe we'll talk. Maybe we won't. And then she was gone. Julian stood in the empty penthouse, the silence pressing against him. He had spent years chasing money, power, and status. But tonight, he finally understood. None of it mattered if he lost the one person who had always believed in him. And now, for the first time in his life, Julian Carter would have to fight for something that couldn't be bought.